Hi, everyone. I'm happy today to introduce Orit Peleg, who works on the physics of living systems, such as swarms or protein assemblies. Recently, she has focused on honeybees and how individual bees sense their microenvironment, interact with the collective and the whole environment in order to confer resilience against environmental fluctuations. She combines carefully designed experiments with theoretical work to address these questions. She's currently a professor at UCU Boulder, as well as affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute. So I'm excited to hear her talk today, and welcome, Orit.
Thank you so much. Thank you and the rest of the organizers for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. It's been a really cool series so far. And I guess this is a good time to share my slides.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that. And
there we go, perfect.
Okay, could you just confirm that you can see them?
Yep, I can see everything.
Okay, great. So what I want to tell you about today is related to honeybees, as Adam already mentioned. But before I dive into that, I just want to say a few brief words, first of all, about what. But before I dive into that, I just want to say a few brief words, first of all, about what. But before I dive, there is a bit of a feedback.
Sorry, that was from my end.
Okay. Should be okay now. Okay, let me switch back to my slides. All right. So a bit more generally, what topics I'm more excited about is I'm trained as a physicist and computer scientist, and I'm sort of using these two tools from these two fields as a lens through which I'm looking at nature, and I'm really interested in how organisms sample their local environment for information that is tend to be kind of physicsy. So examples of that are sensing chemical gradients in chemotaxis in cells, sensing light gradients in phototropism in plants, again in chemical information using olfactory research in insects that use that to find mates and food. And then things become a bit more complicated and interesting when you put a bunch of these organisms together and they have to sample the environment for this physicsy information, but also receive physical information from their neighboring organisms. And a couple of famous examples of that are pheromones trails that are laid by ants, slime molds that forage for food and find the most optimal ways to find their sources of food, that are the white spots over here. And then, of course, all the famous beautiful examples of swarms or large groups of insects and fish and birds that are able to move very efficiently in large groups. So the kind of organism that I'm going to focus on today is honeybees. And just to kind of give you a very brief overview of their interesting life cycle, I thought I'd spend 1 or 2 slides telling you about some basic behaviors, behavior biology of honeybees, so that we're on the same page. So a colony of honeybees has one queen. It has a bunch of drones, about 15% of the colony is drones, and then the rest are females, the worker bees. And during their life cycle, they, sometime during the spring or summer months, their colony size increases in number, and they split into 2 parts. And one part and a queen fly away, and creating this swarm cloud that I'm showing here on the upper right. And once it's actually a really amazing thing to watch if you ever get a chance to happen to be next to a colony hive of honeybees, just as they're doing that. So they're creating these large swarm clouds where about 60% of the colony leaves the nest. And then they land somewhere, usually on a tree branch, and they create that structure that I'm highlighting here with my cursor, which you can see on the bottom. This is a temporary structure And then once they're in this temporary structure, they send out scouts that make decisions about where to form a more long-term housing, either in feral, for feral bees, that would be probably tree cavities, is shown at the bottom here, or more commercially available boxes, hive boxes that beekeepers use. So that's kind of generally about their life cycle. And actually, when I was invited and I looked at the title of this lecture series, and it includes the term neuro, I was a bit unsure whether that's what I'm doing is actually a good fit. But I do want to make a quick connection to neurobiology, where people think about the analogy between the collection of honeybees as a swarm that makes collective decisions, as well as neurons, and how a collection of neurons makes decisions. And hope that would kind of speak to your heart, and then I'll probably switch to talk about something a bit different. But I just wanted to highlight this. So it's a fascinating kind of behavior of information, transferring information. This was discovered and mainly studied by Carol and Frisch, who also won the Nobel Prize for this. So in the temporary structures that I just mentioned a slide ago, the bees send out scouts, and the scouts try to find a permanent or more long-term position for their nest, and they come back. And the scouts would then, in turn, advertise the position of the nest that they found, and they're able to convey information about the direction and the distance to that location, as well as the quality, using the waggle dance. Oops, that's the wrong movie. Let me see if that would play. Not. Okay, well, I'll just scroll through it. Oh, okay. I'm not sure why that's not playing. That's a shame, but the bee would perform a waggle dance, which is really fun to watch. So if you can do that offline, please do. The bee would sort of waggle its body along this axis, as shown here in this diagram on the left side, and then return and do an 8-figure, and then do this waggle dance, and that kind of pattern has information about the direction, the distance, and the quality. And then more recently, it was discovered by Tom Seeley and co-workers that the bees are also able to inhibit other bees that are performing this waggle dance, or basically say, hold on, there's a better nest position. So we have on the left side here excitation, and then we have inhibition, and these kind of processes are well suited for posing as a dynamical system, and solving that as a dynamical system. So we have a group of bees that are supporting site A, a group of bees that are supporting site B. They can excite each other, they can suppress each other, and more recently there's been some very nice papers that making the connection between this system of honeybees and the systems of neurons and collective of neurons that can also excite and inhibit, and looking at the similarities between these two. So, but that's not really the focus of my talk. I'm going to talk about collective decision-making in honeybees, but it's going to be based on sampling local information from the environment, and communicating that information to others. And that information is going to be related to either mechanics, which is the first set of problems that I would like to describe today. And I'm going to focus on those temporary structures that the bees create, shown here on the upper side, upper part of the slide. And then, so that's one kind of information from the environment, and the other one is related to flows. So I'm gonna describe a few examples where honeybees use flows to either ventilate their hive or find the queen, and all of this is based on sensing these flows and local temperatures. Okay, so before I move on to these problems, I want to mention that The basis of all of this happened back when I was a postdoc at Harvard at a group of El Mahadevan. And most of these examples that I want to show you today were done in collaboration with Jake Peters, who was a graduate student at the time over there, as well as Mary Salsado. And so I'll talk about these examples, and I'll also intersperse them with some new work that is done in my lab on these topics. All right, so let me start with sampling mechanical information from the environment in honeybee swarms. And again, I'm going to focus on these kind of structures. The temporary structures that the bees create as part of their life cycle, where they're moved towards a new nest site. So this is an example of such a feral swarm that we found back when I was at Harvard. And it's really important to know that there's nothing besides trees, a tree branch, and bees. So the bees are sort of holding on to each other, and they create that structure basically by linking their own bodies. And when they're in this temporary structure, they don't have a nest structure to protect themselves from the elements. So they have to adapt to the environment in a bit more dynamic way. And indeed they do. So we know, for example, that the bees adapt to ambient to the ambient temperature. So here on the right side, you can see a swarm that is present at cold temperatures, 11 Celsius, versus a hotter environment, 27 Celsius. And you can see that the volume or the density, in fact, of the swarm changes. They also can respond to rain, which is the picture here on the bottom. And they basically arrange themselves along the axis of gravity, creating something that people refer to as shingle-like structure. It's kind of like a roof, potentially making the bees less susceptible to water. And then also at really high temperatures, it's speculated by Bernd Heinrich that the bees created channels inside the swarm that helps them exchange air between the hot swarm and the colder environment. So all of these processes are, of course, complicated. The coordination of these processes is complicated, but underneath all of them, there is the mechanical problem of stabilizing this structure. And as I mentioned before, this is really just done by bees that are sort of holding hands to create that structure. So the bees have to adapt to several different aspects of their environment. So here are 3 examples of swarms. They need to be able to adapt to the shape of the branch. Different shapes result in different shapes of the swarm. They have to be able to deal with static mechanical forces that are just coming from gravity, but also more dynamic ones that are coming from potentially wind. So here in the movie on the upper right, this is a feral swarm on a windy day. It's going to get shaken because the branch is going to move because of the wind. And if they break, this can be quite catastrophic for the bees, because they might not be, they're going to fall to the ground, might not be able to fly back to the swarm, especially if it's the temperatures are low. And so this can be quite catastrophic. And it's really quite remarkable that this such a large swarm is able to maintain mechanical stability. I did not mention that before. There's something at the order of 50,000 bees on average, sometimes even more. And because that structure is so large, that means that one bee at one edge of the swarm can potentially coordinate and communicate directly with its neighboring bees, but it cannot directly communicate with bees that are at the completely other side of the swarm. And maintaining mechanical stability sometimes demands this simultaneous coordination. So it's really quite amazing that they're able to create these structures that tend to not break, at least as far as we can tell. So the goal of this project was to understand what kind of local information from the neighboring nearby bees could potentially be used here in order to maintain the global stabilization of the swarm. So to address that problem, we worked with real honeybees. I always like to point out that until that point, I was mostly doing modeling of biological materials, and that was my first venture into experiments, which is kind of funny because the kind of experiments which we did was the premise was somewhat simple, but a little bit scary, because we decided to just create a swarm in the lab as shown here and shake it and see what happens. It was a very exploratory idea, and we recorded the shape of the swarm from a couple of different angles and recorded it over time. And then we also had a vertical version of this experiment. So what we found out from these preliminary exploratory experiments is that when we shake the bees right and left for a while, they start moving around inside the swarm, and they collectively change the shape of the swarm. So this is a high-speed version of this experiment. We have the front view and the bottom view, and we're shaking them along right and left, so along the directions of right and left of that slide. And this is how it looks like. So we are shaking them for half an hour, and as you can see, the swarm starts with a cone-like shape that has a certain height and base area. And when we shake them, they spread out. And when we stop, which is just around here, then they slowly start going back to their steady state configuration. So we decided to study this a bit more systematically. What you see here is a plot of the base area, which is highlighted here. So basically the area of the swarm looking from the bottom. As a function of time, that's the x-axis time. And we're showing this as for a couple of different frequencies of perturbation. So how much right and left shaking can we have in 1 second? Those are these frequencies. And you can see that as the frequency increases, the higher the frequency is, the more the swarm spreads out. And this dotted line over here, the black dotted line, is where we stop the perturbation. So you can see that there is also a very different time scale for the returning of the swarm into the steady state configuration. It's much slower than the spreading out. Since we're dealing with frequencies, we can actually plot this data a little bit differently. So instead of plotting the area of the base as a function of time, we can plot it as a function of perturbation events, where a perturbation event is one shake to the right, one to the left. And we can see that they all fall on this universal curve, besides, of course, the different plateau values that are you can see over here. But the fact that the growth rate of the base area as a function of number of perturbation events was an indication for us that there is some kind of universal response to these shaking events. So that was the effect of frequency. Next, we fixed the frequency at 1 Hertz, and we tried to change something else. In this case, it was the acceleration that we apply on the board. Very similar plot. We're plotting the base area as a function of time, and the different colors correspond to different acceleration. Like before, the higher the acceleration is, the more the swarm spreads out. And everything I showed you until now was for shaking horizontally, so right and left. And then we tried the same experiment, but instead of right and left, we are shaking now the swarm up and down. And we see something totally different. So the swarm did not spread out. It did not respond in the same way that the swarm responded to the right and left perturbation. And actually, if we crank up the accelerations and the forces that we apply, at some point the swarm just breaks, as shown in this movie over here. We did not really explore this regime too much because it takes a couple of hours for the swarm to reassemble. What's going on? What did the bees respond to the horizontal shaking, but not to the vertical shaking? And to answer that question, turn back more towards my comfort zone of modeling, where we're going to treat the swarm as an elastic material, and we're going to take snapshots of the swarm at different shapes, different spreading amounts, and try to say something about these mechanical properties. And the reason we break it down into these different shapes along the spreading out is because the time scale of the perturbation that we apply is much shorter, is at the order of seconds or fractions of a second in comparison to the time scales that it takes the swarm to spread out, which is 30 minutes or so. Okay, so this is the very, very simplified model of our honeybee swarm. We have spherical bees that are connected by elastic springs. And the first method that we use to say something about the mechanics of these swarms is called a normal mode analysis, where we're basically looking for the most typical modes of motion that we would expect to see in these kind of structures that demand the least amount of energy, so they're more likely to occur in nature. And the mathematics and equations of these are, they're simple because we're just using spring potentials for the forces, and then making an assumption here at the second line that we're only dealing with small deformations. It becomes a little bit more complicated to solve this because we have many bees in our swarm, so we have many coupled equations, many of these coupled equations. So we put it basically into matrix form, and then we solve Newton's equation of motion, F equals ma. Happy to talk about this more if anybody is interested later on. But basically, once we solve this system of equations, we're getting the lowest energy or lowest frequency normal modes. And we can see that one of them is a pendular mode, where everything moves kind of right and left. And the other one is a spring mode, where everything kind of stretches up and down. And if you look at the frequencies of these modes, which is shown here on the y-axis as a function of the aspect ratio of the swarm, we see two things. First of all, as the swarm becomes more elongated, then the frequency becomes lower. So it means that it's basically easier to invoke these modes. You need less energy put in the system in order to invoke them. And then the second thing is that there's always a gap between the spring and the pendular mode. So it's always easier, in a sense, kind of air brackets, to invoke the pendular mode where everything swings right and left in comparison to the spring mode. And indeed, this is something that we can see in the experiments. So here is a slow-mo movie of a horizontal perturbation. And we can see that we essentially invoke that pendular mode, especially at the tip of the swarm. And then if we take the same swarm and apply the same perturbation, the only difference is that now it's going to be up and down. This is how it's look like. So this is a bit more hard to see. There's a little bit of that stretch mode. But the local deformations between pairs of bees that we can visually see in this case is much smaller in comparison to the local deformations we can see for the horizontal shaking. And the fact that they respond to the horizontal shaking and not to the vertical one suggests that maybe these local deformations is a signal, a mechanical signal that the bees use in order to stabilize the swarm. So to test this hypothesis, we go back to the computational model. Again, just spheres connected by elastic springs, but we also have some excluded volume, and we also have gravity. And then now we can actually solve the equations of motion as a function of time and follow the dynamics of some of these potential local signals that the bees might be using. I'm specifically going to look at the instantaneous stretches and strains of local bonds that each bee is making to all of its neighbors. And then I'm going to take a geometrical average of all of these stretching and represent it in this equation as a potential local signal. Okay, so here's an example for some of these simulations. We have a three-dimensional swarm that is cut at the center along the plane of the slide so that we can see what's happening at the inside the swarm. And the color corresponds to shear or deformations. So blue means low and yellow means high deformations. And then we can see that we are consistent with the experiments in the sense that for a horizontal perturbation, there's quite a lot of yellow up here close to the base. And then applying the same kind of perturbation just vertically, the local deformations are reduced. We can also look at the effect of aspect ratio. We have, again, the same movie from before for an elongated swarm compared to a more spread out swarm. You can see that, again, there's much less yellow, much less deformations in this kind of configuration. So effectively, when the bees move from the elongated to the spread out configuration, they also reduce the local deformations that we think could be a local signal that the bees might be using. And finally, I just want to go back to those different plateau values that I showed a few slides ago. When we shake the bees at different frequencies, this is kind of a hand wavy explanation. But what we think is going on is that at low frequencies, we shake the swarm once. It has enough time to relax before we start the next perturbation. But at high frequencies, the swarm doesn't have this privilege. And of course, that creates higher strains and deformations also closer to the tip of the swarm. Okay, so finally, I just want to put it all together as a proof of concept that using local deformations as a local rule could lead the swarm to spread out just based on local information, local mechanical information. And to do that, I'm going to extend the simulations a little bit further by allowing each bee or each sphere to sense the local deformations that are created by movement of the neighbors and integrate that signal over time and then decide to do something. So, sorry, the signal is being integrated. This is an illustration of how this is done. So one shake to the right, one shake to the left, and summing all up and representing the strains in colors. Same thing for the vertical. Okay, and then we have the signal, and we just basically need to tell the bees what to do. So since we know from the experiments that the bees respond to the horizontal perturbation and not so much the vertical, we can set some kind of threshold on this local signal that would get the bees being shaken horizontally respond more. So that can trigger them to do something. But now we have to tell them what to do. So from the experiments, we know that the bees move upwards, and that leads to the spreading out of the swarm. But upward is actually requires some kind of global reference point. Knowing where upward is might be a bit problematic when a bee is inside a very dense and shaky environment inside a swarm. So instead, we define directionality by looking at the gradient of the local signal, the local mechanical signal, which are the strains. And this is shown here in little black arrows, which I hope you can see. But if not, then they're basically pointing upwards and a little bit to the side. So now we can put it all together. Once a threshold is being met, the bees are going to follow this local signal and push their way upwards. And then, this is kind of what we're programmed in. So it's not very surprising that bees on the vertical perturbation doesn't get triggered, so they don't get spread out But this is really just a proof of concept that this spreading out and adaptation of the shape could be achieved by sensing local strains as shown in this simulation. Okay, so just to summarize this part, I showed you that swarms regulate their shape when they're experiencing mechanical perturbation and sensitive to a couple of different things like frequency, force, and directionality. What we think is going on is that they modulate their aspect ratio to minimize these local deformations. I also want to point out that according to these local rules of behavior, which, I mean, they're in correlation with our experiments, I want to be very careful and make sure I say that we don't know really what's going on inside the bees in terms of the decision making. We don't know if this is really what they're sensing. But this local set of rules of behavior would suggest that bees move from areas in the swarm where strains are low to areas in the swarms where strains are higher. And they do this for the greater good of the entire colony. That's just something to kind of keep in mind, but also, you know, a little bit more back down to earth. What is happening is the bees somehow found a way to have an intuitive understanding of elasticity fields that are on a much larger scale than the size of an individual, and respond to them in a way that helps the swarm maintain mechanical stability. So I want to quickly just mention a few. I might actually skip this example. We're right now just following and trying to answer questions about the formation of the swarm, as well as trying to peek into the swarm using X-rays, because until now we can only see what happens on the surface of the swarm, but we actually have access to an X-ray machine, and we can reconstruct the density of bees inside the swarm and see some interesting things like these layers that the bees create, as well as modulation of the density inside the swarm. Okay. I'm going to move to the next set of examples where instead of mechanical forces, I'm going to talk about using airflows that are in a sense as well mechanics in order to, first I'm going to talk about ventilation of their hives. Honeybees have a range of temperatures in which they feel comfortable. Actually, many social organisms do, most organisms do in a sense. And other social insects like ants and termites actually built their own nests from materials, and they're in a sense have the privilege to design structures that help them ventilate and cool down their nests. And bees don't really have this privilege because they tend to nest in pre-existing cavities. Those, at least in this part of the world, those tend to be tree cavities as shown here. These tree cavities, you know, would have different volumes and different entry sizes. It's been shown that the bees actually do try to optimize some of these aspects when they choose where to move their more permanent nest to. But again, the bees must do something more active in order to ventilate their hive. It turns out that what's happening is that the bees use their wings as little fans, basically. They stand in front of the entrance of the hive. So for commercial hives, if you haven't seen one before, it's really just a wooden box that have a very narrow slit as an entrance. And the bees would stand in front of that entrance and fan their wings. And these are experiments that were done a couple of years ago by Jake Peters, who showed here in this PAV measurement of the airflow and showing that the airflow is moving backwards, essentially. But if one bee does this, then nothing would really happen because it's so small in comparison to the size of the the hive. So the bees do this in groups. They would, as shown here in the movie on the right side, they would group along the entrance, and they would all fan their wings together. And this way, they're able to create a much larger airflow and exchange air from inside and outside the hive. But there are a couple of challenges using this approach. Here again, this is a picture of the entrance. So that's the narrow slit that I mentioned before. And you can see that the bees are sort of, most of them are on the right side of the entrance. And I hope that by the time I finish talking about this project, you will understand potentially why they're doing that. So the first challenge is related to fluid friction. So imagine that we have a group of bees that are fanning and drawing air in one direction. And because of conservation of volume, we're going to have air coming into the hive from the non-occupied areas of the entrance. And then we're going to have an interface between inwards and backward flows. So we're going to lose some energy due to fluid friction because of all of these interfaces. And the more interfaces we have, of course, the more friction that will occur. The other challenge is related to creating opposing airflows that are sort of fighting each other, in a sense that if we have a group of bees that are fanning on one side and they're creating flow from inside the hive backwards, there's going to be air coming in on the non-occupied side. But if suddenly bees start fanning on the non-occupied side, they're going to create opposing flows, and we're going to lose some energy as well due to that. So the question that we wanted to answer here is where to ventilate. So again, we're assuming that we're dealing with relatively large colonies, large entry size. What kind of local information could the bees be using to arrange themselves in groups of fanning bees? And to answer that question, Jake ran some experiments, and I should say that my contribution here was just the mathematical, related to the mathematical model. So all these experiments were run by Jake Peters. And as a start, he just placed a temperature and air velocity and a camera measurement devices along the entrance of the hive. And this is just a movie showing a typical experiment. So he's moving this measurement device along the entrance, getting readout on the temperature and the velocity. And these initial experiments were actually quite helpful, because we saw that the air velocity, the temperature, and the density of bees that are fanning are all correlated. So here I'm showing all of these three quantities, and the x-axis is the position along the entrance. So we wanted to understand this further by using a mathematical model to try to understand how all of these quantities are coupled, in a sense, in a dynamical way. We have three quantities that we are going to follow. We have the density of fanners, we have the temperature entrance, and the air velocity, again approximating the entrance into a one-dimensional system because it's a very long slit. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. One is that fanners drive flow out of the hives. We know that because we see that their head is pointed towards the entrance, and we know that they're drawing air backwards. We also know from experiments done actually here at CU Boulder by Mike Reed that bees tend to start fanning at higher temperatures. So they have these measurable on and off rates for starting the fanning depending on the ambient temperature. We assume conservation of volume. So for any cube of air that comes out of the hive, a cube of air has to come in to compensate for that. And also, as I mentioned before, when we have velocity gradients of opposing flows, we're going to lose some energy due to friction. So these are the assumptions. And in the next slide, I mean, you can either understand that, but I'm also going to show you the actual mathematical equations. This is the first one. So this is an equation that couples the density of fanning bees to the on and off rates of starting to fan and stopping to fan based on the temperature. We have another equation that is basically capturing Newton's laws of cooling. Then we have another equation that couples the air velocity to the conservation of volume, as well as a friction term that captures the friction from opposing flows. Happy to talk about these more later if anybody is interested. The point is that we have these three coupled equations, and we can actually solve them numerically. And here is an example of that. So the y-axis in this heat map shows the entrance position. The x-axis is time. And the color is the density of fanning bees, where yellow is high. So we can see that we start from some kind of random distribution of bees that are fanning, and then slowly they start emerging big clusters of bees that are fanning, and essentially one of these big clusters sort of swallows the smaller cluster. And we can see that this process is accompanied by reduced friction, which is the blue plot over here. So the blue is representing the cost of friction as a function of time. We can see that as these clusters emerge, we lose less energy due to friction. We can use that model to make predictions for longer term dynamics of those clusters. And I'm showing you three different examples with three different ambient temperatures. On the left, we have a low ambient temperature, and we can see that the cluster of fanning bees is kind of moving randomly along the entrance. At higher ambient temperature, that cluster still exists, but it tends to cling to one of the sides. And then at really high ambient temperatures, it's becoming hard to distinguish between the inside and outside temperature. So we essentially don't see any clusters at all. And the cool thing is that we can actually test these predictions. So Jake designed a very nice measurement device that is being placed at the entrance of the hive, and these little droplets that I hope you can see are temperature measurement devices, and they're logging this information, over days, basically. And then we can see, so we can get a readout of the temperature and the approximate position of the cluster of fanning bees over a few days. Here I'm just showing it for 3 consecutive days. The upper plot is the ambient temperature, so we can see the day-night cycle of those 3 days. And the bottom plot is a proxy for the position of the fanning bees. And we can actually see these 2 different regimes that were predicted by the model, where at low ambient temperatures, we have a cluster that is kind of fluctuating and moving around, whereas at high ambient temperatures, we have a cluster that tends to just cling to one of the sides. Okay, so again, this is, I think, another cool example of how bees sort of sample local information from their environment, in this case, temperature, and harness it in order to achieve some global function. In this case, it's ventilating their hive and arrange into clustering fanning bees. In the last 2 minutes that I have left, I want to mention that right now my lab is extending this work of using airflow, but in combination of chemical communication, and how the bees do exactly the same thing. So how do they harness information from their local environment and make some decisions, take some actions that help them propagate that information further. That process again, so we know that bees have actually many different kinds of pheromones, but the ones that I'm going to focus on these last 2 slides is called the Nasonov gland. So it's this white stripe here that is highlighted by the arrow, and the bees actually have a very specific posture that they need to do in order to open up that gland on their abdomen. And when they send and when they open up this gland, they also fan their wings. So they drive airflow on top of that gland and potentially moving these pheromones backwards. And in a sense, they have the ability to direct that signal and choose the direction in which they produce that signal. So we were trying to understand how the bees use this in order to localize the queen. The bees essentially find the queen using her pheromones, but they decay very rapidly in time and space. So we were trying to understand how the bees propagate that information further using advection. And that work was mostly led by Dumai, who is a PhD student in the lab, but also in collaboration with Greg Stephens and Kesha, who is his postdoc, who helped us design and build a machine learning code to help us identify automatically these kind of behaviors, the scenting behaviors of the bees. Sorry, let me stop this. Okay, hard to do. I just want to show you one example of this experiment. So the queen is located here on the upper right side of this experimental arena, which is somewhat two-dimensional. We start the bees on the exactly opposite corner, and we just let them do their thing, and we can see that they are aggregating around the queen. And then using the machine learning code, we can actually see all the bees that are scenting, and we basically have a readout of the spatiotemporal pattern of the scenting events. So we can take all of them and see whether they're actually leading to the queen, which we can do by reconstructing a global map of where the queen would be most likely to be in that setup. We see that indeed the scenting events lead to the queen, as shown here in this heat map. And we're also correlating this with an agent-based model that help guide us through answering questions about why is directionality actually important here in terms of communicating that chemical signal. So we can have agents that produce a directional signal or isotropic signal, and then putting them in again in a simulation arena that is two-dimensional, and see how they propagate that information essentially and eventually aggregating around the queen. So that work has a preprint on the bioRxiv. You're welcome to take a look if you're interested. And I think I'm really out of time, so I'm just gonna finish and thank all of my collaborators, my new lab at CU Boulder, funding agencies, and thank you so much for your attention. Hopefully you're still there. I wasn't able to see anything.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to start off with a question, because I was wondering, in the second part of your talk, you have all these bees coming in and out, and trying to, some % of them will do the
Fanning.
what do you call it? The
yes.
Fanning. Yes. Is it probabilistic which ones will do it? Are they like locked on? Like they will start fanning if they sense the temperature being like outside of some set point? Is it different by the cast? Like how does that happen?
So we don't know. It is probabilistic. So we know that if given a certain ambient temperature, there is a probability for the bees to start fanning. But we don't know if it's always the same bees who are fanning, which I think is the question you were asking. And it's a really interesting question that we just didn't have the means to study, because it means we will have to continuously track these bees, and that just wasn't possible at the time. I think it maybe with different setup that would be possible.
Great. So also Sama asks, very cool, you showed at the start that individual bees change their orientation during rain in this shingle formation. I imagine that this will change the swarm's ability to deal with horizontal versus vertical perturbations. Have you played with that in your model?
That's cool. I agree. I have the same intuition that I think it would make a difference. But we haven't tried that, not in the model and actually not in the experiment, but we could, throw water at the bees and get them to orient this way, and then shake them and see what happens. I think that this would be especially interesting to do with the X-ray. Yeah.
I also have another question about, are there any cases where there's conflicting needs or conflicting, macroscopic behaviors that the bees need to perform, where they have local information, but they need to decide between these two? Like, obviously they can't swarm and, deal with airflow, or like, but maybe there's another.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of examples. One that is related to what I showed today is the need to balance thermal regulation with mechanical stability. So the swarms, the structure, the first part of the talk, they create a certain shape. It's kind of like a cone shape. From the perspective of thermal regulation, what they would want to do, the optimal thing to do, is actually to create half a sphere, because that has the minimal surface area and losing heat to the environment. But this is being balanced by the mechanical stability. So when we're shaking them, they're creating something that is very far away from a half a sphere, and they're somehow know that, okay, now the shaking has stopped, so it's time to go back and optimize the thermal regulation again. So they go back slowly to their steady state configuration.
Unless we have any more questions from the audience, I will thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll stay up on YouTube for people who want to watch it later.
Great.
And thank you so much, Orit, for speaking.
Yeah, thank you too. Hope to meet all of you in person at some point.